Well, good evening, and welcome to our concert. And first, a little pre-concert talk as billed. Glad to see all of you here tonight. So I'm just going to talk rather briefly and very generally about George Bristow, the composer, and his Mass, the work that we're singing tonight. And this is really a momentous occasion because it is evidently the world premiere of this work, even though it's an old work composed in 1885. It seems to be a world premiere. So more about that as I go on. You can read the notes in your program, and I don't want to duplicate those, but just realize there's some information there as well. So I just want to talk also briefly about the Mass as a musical form, and many of us in the room are familiar with that concept, perhaps some aren't. So there is this long tradition, this long history of composers setting all 5 or 6 movements of the Mass, depending how they divide it. And this goes back to medieval times, going back to the Middle Ages. And so the first named composer of a Mass cycle with all these movements, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, etc., was Guillaume de Machaut, and he composed his Mass in the mid-1300s. And that tradition continues up through the present day, and then according to the musical style of the day. So some composers added instruments. Sometimes the Mass was set for choir and a full orchestra, sometimes with soloists, as in the Mass that you'll hear tonight. Over the years, composers set the Mass partially because it was their job to do so, but also partially to prove themselves as composers. And we also then have the rise of Masses that were intended more as concert pieces and less for actual liturgical function or function in worship. So these got longer and longer in some cases. And so an example of this is J.S. Bach's Mass in B minor. So I think roughly 2, maybe 2.5 hours in length, depending on your tempos. But Bach is an example of a composer setting the Mass who was not Roman Catholic. And that also is part of this tradition of Mass composition. Composers who aren't Roman Catholic and in fact maybe aren't Christian, but because this is such a long tradition in composition, composers decided to try their hand at these texts. George Bristow, in fact, was an Episcopalian, so he's an example of that in a way. So, George Bristow, briefly, he was based in New York City in the 1800s, and he was a violinist, organist, conductor, including a conductor of choral organizations, and a public school music teacher, in addition to being a composer. In the 1800s, there were Americans writing what we call maybe classical music or concert music. As an example of some of the way that studies of music history are biased, in my music history class when I was in college, our professor mentioned some of these names of American composers, such as John Knowles Paine and Arthur Foote, George Chadwick, and so on. And, but the attitude of the professor was, well, these people really aren't very important. Let's get back to talking about European composers. So you see the issue. And it's an issue that continues to this day, of course. So now even these composers that I just mentioned, John Knowles Paine, Dudley Buck, some of these others, they had credentials of a type in that most all of them studied in Europe. They made their European sojourns, and got credentialed, as it were, studying with masters in the old country, the genesis of all this music. And then in some cases, these composers also had academic degrees, master's degrees in music, which were at that time relatively new in this country, and then later in the 1800s, doctoral degrees in music, which were very new. I can't think of the decade at the moment, but 1870s, 1880s, around in there. So George Bristow, our composer tonight, had neither of these. He did not study in Europe. He did not have academic credentials. And I think that those two facts are reasons that his music was, to an extent, passed over even during his lifetime, but certainly after his death in 1898. He was mostly forgotten. Okay, but then there's been a little bit of a revival of George Bristow's music in the last 20, 30 years, and some of his longer works have begun to be published. So George Bristow, what did he write? He wrote a few symphonies, including a symphony called the Niagara Symphony, as in Niagara Falls. And the Niagara Symphony has this closing section that uses chorus. And, of course, that's very much like Beethoven 9, right? The Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. And so he was sort of using Beethoven, I think, as a pattern there. But the symphony extols the beauties of Niagara Falls and the natural wonders of the Great Lakes. Okay, Niagara Symphony. Bristow wrote solo piano music. He wrote an oratorio called the Oratorio of Daniel, as in the book of the Hebrew Bible, Daniel. And he also wrote an opera, which was Rip Van Winkle. So, the very American story of Rip Van Winkle set. And it's one of the first American operas, actually, that was written. And that opera has been recorded, and it has been published also in relatively recent years. So, now to this work tonight, the Mass in C. Bristow finished his Mass in 1885. He wrote it originally with orchestra accompaniment. It was a large orchestra, I should say it is, because the score now exists, a large orchestra with woodwinds, brass, timpani, and strings. Bristow also created a reduction of the orchestra parts for organ accompaniment, and that is the version that we're using tonight. So Bristow himself created this organ reduction. For the performance tonight, just a little bit of an aside, I wanted to make sure that we had an organ that had a lot of dynamic flexibility in it. So not every pipe organ would play this music well. But because there's a lot of dynamic shading, there are divisions of the organ under expression. That is, the organist uses expression pedals to open and close shutters for dynamic changes. That's very helpful for this work. That makes it perhaps more orchestral than some organs. Okay? So Bristow's Mass was never published in his lifetime. Most of it survives only in manuscript form, that is, the composer's own hand. And the manuscripts exist in the New York Public Library, Lincoln Center Division. If any of you ever want to go, they might allow you to look at Bristow's manuscripts. That library holds most of Bristow's surviving manuscripts, by the way. The Kyrie, the first movement of it, was actually typeset. I don't know if we can necessarily say that it was published per se, but it was typeset, and it survives that way. So, my job, and this was a project for my doctoral degree in choral conducting, and I wasn't necessarily looking to do something by George Bristow. I wasn't necessarily looking to create an edition, but I stumbled upon this listing of, a Mass in C by George Bristow. I wonder what that is about. So I think borrowed microfilm, and I was at University of Iowa, borrowed microfilm from the Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library, some of it, and was able to see some of this and realized that this was something that needed some attention. So, was this Mass ever performed? I'm calling this a world premiere. I think we're justified in doing so. We know for certain that the Kyrie, the first movement, was performed 3 times at least in a church where Bristow worked as a music director. And we also know that the Benedictus was performed in a meeting of a composers' society, but that was only with piano and cello accompanying. It's also likely that the Gloria, or parts of it, were also performed, because also in the Lincoln Center Library, there is a set of vocal parts, separate vocal parts for the Gloria, and there are some markings on those parts, and the parts are hole punched for 3-ring binders, and it looks like they were used. Okay, now, there's no surviving record that says, yes, Bristow's Mass was performed at this church or in this concert or wherever, but those parts are certainly good evidence. For the rest of the piece, the rest of the movements, these have never been performed as far as we know. Okay, so again, a momentous occasion tonight, I think. A little bit about the music. Bristow was influenced by the European music that he knew, so composers such as Haydn, Beethoven, and Mendelssohn, but also Italian opera, and especially in the writing for the soloists over here, they'll be in later, you'll hear some operatic touches, more so than the way that he writes for the choir. Specifically, I'll point out a couple of influences, and odds are, because we have a community chorus here and some other people interested in music, odds are really good that some of you in the room have sung a piece or part of a piece called Mozart's 12th Mass, as in Mass number 12, Mozart's 12th Mass. If that rings a bell with you and you think you've sung that piece or part of it, would you raise your hand? I'm just curious. No, there's one over there. Yeah. Okay, a few, and probably, thank you, so probably more of you really have sung the quote, Mozart's unquote, 12th Mass, which is not really by Mozart. It was by, evidence suggests that it was by a composer named Wenzel Müller, and he wrote this piece and decided to pawn it off as being by Mozart. Now, it's a nice piece. In fact, the Gloria of that Mass is one of the first, I think maybe the first Mass movement that I ever sang as a sophomore in high school. Oh, we're singing Mozart. Great. Not really. But the reason that I mentioned that 12th Mass of Mozart is that there's some really clear influence from Mozart's 12th Mass on Bristow's Mass in terms of the arrangement of the keys, the way he divides the text. And we know that Bristow conducted Mozart's, actually Müller's, 12th Mass at least once. There are also influences from the 2 Masses of Beethoven. So Beethoven wrote a Mass in C. Aha. So Beethoven, Mass in C. Aha. George Bristow, Mass in C. And Beethoven also wrote the Missa Solemnis, a much larger scale work. It's really clear that Bristow had heard or maybe even performed in those works. Perhaps as a violinist, we don't know, but those works were performed in New York City in the 1870s and I think the 1880s as well. So before Bristow wrote his Mass. So there's some influences there. The clearest influence from the Beethoven masses is in the Credo, where the choir sings Et resurrexit tertia die, and he rose again on the third day. And this is the only point in the piece where Bristow sets the text for choir alone, without any accompaniment. It's a short, unaccompanied section. And I'm pretty sure he got that idea from the Beethoven Missa Solemnis, which does exactly the same thing. Again, I'll just refer you to the program notes. There's a little more information there, maybe with a little bit of a different flavor. And also at the end of the program notes, I do mention my dissertation. Now, dissertations are not good summertime reading. However, if you're curious, and it's not a long, as dissertations go, it's not a long one, because it's not a PhD dissertation, it's a DMA dissertation. I'm a performer, not a theorist or musicologist. But you can choose your section if you want to learn a little bit more about the Mass, and you can see the score also. Anyway, that's available online just by typing in search words, my last name Bailey, and then Bristow, and then Mass, and it'll come up as one of the top results. I'm really thankful tonight that we're able to do this concert at all, because as many of you know, this concert was originally scheduled for March 13th, 2020. And on March 11th, our dress rehearsal was scheduled, and 2.5 hours before the dress rehearsal, we decided that due to the growing number of COVID-19 cases, we needed to postpone indefinitely. We thought it might be just a postponement until May of 2020. Wishful thinking. So now here we are, a little over 2 years later, and we're finally able to do it. But it's so great that we were able to get Matt Bickett back on the organ, who was at that time, 2 years ago, he was the organist here at Fairmount Pres, which is a big reason why I hired him. He knows the instrument. He moved away in 2020, not long after all this was originally scheduled. And then our 4 soloists were another matter, but it turned out they were all available on this date. Matt Bickett was able to travel back to Cleveland, and so we have pretty much the original cast. I think the members of the choir are slightly different, we're slightly fewer, but I'm so glad that we're able to do this for you. We'll take a short break, and Rachel Singer of Choral Arts will have just a few announcements for you. I want to say, though, a big thank you to the staff and the clergy of Fairmount Presbyterian Church for allowing us here to come back and to do this concert. It's tricky to schedule this kind of thing sometimes, but they've been very helpful, and I really appreciate that. So I think at this time I'll turn it over to Rachel. I'll take a bit of a break for myself, and I'll see you at 8 p.m. or very shortly thereafter.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all so much for coming this evening. I'm Rachel Singer. I am the president of the board of Choral Arts Cleveland. We are so excited to finally perform this piece again after over 2 years. Just to let you know, Choral Arts is a nonprofit organization, and we are supported by member dues, grants, and individual donors. So we'd like to thank the Ohio Arts Council and Cuyahoga Arts and Culture for supporting this concert. A central component of our mission is presenting concerts that are accessible to everyone. That said, we will gratefully accept donations from any who are able to contribute. There will be donation baskets at the doors on your way out. We also would ask that you please complete the survey that's in each of your programs and return that on your way out. This helps us in our planning and grant writing. And finally, just to echo what Brian said, we would like to thank all who made this concert possible, especially Fairmount Presbyterian. The sanctuary was basically frozen in time for a few months at least after our rehearsal on, I believe, March 9th. And we're so happy to be here again tonight. So as Brian said, we'll be starting again after a brief break. So thank you all for joining us and enjoy the music.
Stars